Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Top Voice Tuesday. Super excited to have with us here Denise Murtha Bachman. Denise, I'm going to give you a chance to do your big intro here in a second, but as is usual, as we open the session today, for those of you that haven't yet subscribed to the YouTube channel where all these episodes sit, please do. Michael J. Lopez 9. The link is in my contact on LinkedIn. And we just got the newsletter up and running. It's called Focus Friday. Those come out on Fridays. They're summaries of these conversations plus insights from my book. And we talk about change and other upcoming events. So that link is right on my LinkedIn profile. Please go hit that link and subscribe. Um, so today, April 8th, hard to believe, we're going to talk about the human side of sales. Last week, we had a great conversation with Chad about a similar topic, but we're going to go a little bit deeper. So before we do that, Denise, please introduce yourself. And as usual, tell us how you got to the top of the Top Voice Mountain.
Yeah, so a little bit short story about who I am. I am here in Houston, Texas. I have been over 30 years in sales. Primarily, I spent that time in software. So the latter part of that 30 was in machine learning, AI, and automation. So I have this passion for new technologies. And I realized there was this huge gap. We were introducing all these new technologies into the sales process, but we weren't really adapting to them effectively. So, in essence, we weren't adopting and adapting in a way that still ensured that we retained that human element in the sales process. So I started my own company. Celevators is my sales, coaching, consulting, and fractional leadership. And so I live here in Houston, Texas. I've got two beautiful children, a husband, a dog, and I focus all of my time on finding ways to do my part in elevating sales so it becomes a noble profession again. So all of that position, that desire and passion for both AI and humanity is what fostered maybe my success here on LinkedIn. I really thrived in that environment and really started generating content, had a great commenting strategy, engaged on lives as guests in the audience. All of that activity is what lended this opportunity to become a top voice. So last year, I think it was, is when I was given the honor of being labeled a top voice, a LinkedIn Blue Badge top voice. So super excited to be here, Michael. Hope that answered both of your questions, who I was and how I earned the badge, because I don't really know other than I generated content and I had a great commenting strategy. So hopefully that answers both of your questions.
That does answer the question. And you said a couple things in there that I want to respond to before we jump in. Super important. And for those of you that are on the chat, please let us know where you're dialing in from. We see a couple comments. Good to see everyone. You mentioned in this idea of adoption and adaptation and the way you were talking about technology and AI and the sales process. And I think those are two terms that I talk about, that I've written about in my book. And just for those that are listening, there's an important distinction between those two things. Adoption is the practice of using something new. So it's about leveraging a new skill, a new technology. Adaptation is really how we adjust our behavior
Yep.
with that new tool, and that is a much different process, and that's real change. And I want to jump into that because I think so much of what we learned from Chad last week was, how do we get the conversation? And what you're going to talk to us about is, okay, so we have the conversation, what next? And I think that's really what people are interested in. Before we do that, one last thing about your top voice journey. You mentioned having a good comment sort of content strategy. Can you say a little bit more about what that was? Maybe just a couple examples?
Yeah, so from a commenting perspective, there is a true strategy, which means I had groups of people that I would engage with. So I had my friends that I had established as, friends that for whatever reason we just connected on LinkedIn, and they were those that I would support regardless of what their topic was, right? But then I also sought out those who were in my space, some that were AI, that were sales, and I would engage with those individuals as well. And then I would, as part of the strategy, so one part of the strategy was the people. Who was I engaging with? The second part of the strategy was how was I engaging? So this quick, hey, thank you, or great topic, those were not the types of comments I would leave.
Mm.
They were purposeful. I would answer any questions. If they posted a question in the content, I would make sure that I answered the question. I also made sure that it was that I was trying to engage in conversation. So if I could, I'd leave a question as at the end of that comment, something that would draw that author, whoever owned that content, to want to engage, or those that didn't own the content, that were just breezing through and reading, that they would want to engage. So it was really creating the comments that were purposeful and that could, when possible, ask questions as well and further conversation. And then the other is I would make sure that I had a daily routine of going out and engaging in,
Mhm.
an hour or so worth of comments. Now, I know people think that it's tedious and time consuming to be here on LinkedIn, and yes, it is, but it's just part of common courtesy and wanting to get to know people and having amazing conversation that should drive that, not this necessity for having to spend time, but really wanting to engage in conversation. Because when you do that, when you create this commenting strategy, it enables you to start having more conversation about the things that are passionate to you. Your messaging gets better, your positioning gets better, how you engage with others gets better, the questions that you ask gets better, the amount of people that want to engage with you gets better. So I always say, if you can't do a content, always do a commenting strategy. And more than just, hey, how's it going? Thanks for a great post, amazing post, how are you? Those types of things. We don't want that. We want purposeful engagement, and we want you to have a strategy around it. And then from a content perspective, it was just making sure that whatever I was generating was really more about having conversation instead of telling people what I've learned, instead
Yeah.
of showing them. It's about making them a part of the conversation, both in the post as they're reading, and then asking for engagement in the comments below. So that was really how I thought about both my content and my commenting strategy. So hopefully that helped.
That's fantastic. I mean, it's so much wisdom. I'm doing a little test. Who's going to be the first to comment in the comment section of the chat while you're talking about having a comment strategy? That it's sort of a meta moment right there. But I think, you said you didn't know how you did it, but I think you really summarized how you did. Purposeful engagement that was thoughtful and directed with questions, not just platitudes, I think is the first thing. I think the second thing is setting aside time and treating it not as a chore, but treating it as a real human activity to create engagement. Just so much wisdom, which leads to the question of the human side of sales and making people feel like part of the conversation. So let's just get right into it. What is a bad sales process, and why is this such a loaded topic these days?
Yeah, so I would say what makes a bad sales process is the process itself. I think we're so fixated on the process that we lose the concept of the human, of the buyer itself. The buyer is what drives that process anyway. And I think when we get so focused on the process rather than the humanization of the sales with those buyers, we that's when it becomes a bad process. So it's just the thought of process alone. Now that doesn't mean we can't have one, right? I do think that processes are important. We should all have them. They create structure. They make sure that we hit certain thresholds or more or excuse me, or marks that we need to achieve. But it's really allowing that as a means to guide us rather than to dictate us. And instead, we focus really on the human aspect, which is, I always say there are three parts to my methodology, which is you should be curious, you should actively listen, and you should be audible ready. And when you do that, innately, you will start to guide yourself and through a process, and you'll together with the buyer be in this buyer's journey in the trenches together that will innately then allow you to make sure that you're hitting all of those process marks. You can still meet all those processes, but it's when the buyer, when you're driving to a process rather than not focusing on the human aspect. Hope that
Yeah.
really answered your question.
It it did, and I, as somebody who has my own um, bias against overly rigid processes, I tend to think about life and those sorts of things in phases more than processes and linear experiences. And I want to talk about each of your three principles. I love that, right? Thinking about phases and principles instead of rigid processes. One of the best compliments I ever got from a client was, I'm not a solution looking for a problem. It's about understanding the problem and then understanding the path through the
Yes.
problem, which may be different every time. But you've given us this idea of a process. But look, you could throw a rock and hit somebody with their proven 5-step process, sales process. I get up hit up with them all the time. How do I tell the difference between a good sales method or process and a bad one without calling out names or, poking anyone in the eye? How do I
Yeah.
tell the difference?
No, that's simple. When you feel like you're in a process, and that's most salespeople, that's when you know it's a bad process. Your buyer should not even think that you're in a process. Look, even on LinkedIn, when we engage in that first DM, everyone knows that you're here to sell something, whether it's your services, your product, your brand. It doesn't really matter. We're all out here doing something that is sales related, right? Even if it's, again, going back to something as simple as your brand. People know that you're selling something when you engage with them, but they don't want to feel it. They don't want to know it. So a bad sales process is when they actually know that they're in that sales process, right?
Mm.
And how to avoid that is really just by focusing on your buyer, your prospect, and not at all focusing on you, right? And I think that's one of the hardest things that we see. Most people, when they engage, they want to share. I mean, we all like to talk about ourselves, so they want to share everything about them and what they do. No one wants to know that right away. They want to know that you care about them and that you are asking about them. So engage in a way that is all about your prospect and your buyer and less about you. When you do that, process goes away. They don't even recognize it. And it becomes more about the journey together again. Like I mentioned that already earlier, but it's about the journey rather than a process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, Chad mentioned this last week, and we're going to get into this building a conversation, building a connection, focusing on the relationship, not focusing on the outcome. So you gave three principles to your approach, let's call it. We don't want to call it a process, but I mean, I guess it is, but we're,
It's a
what
methodology, a
what's in a
some
rose is
principles, whatever,
is
yeah.
is kind of the conversation we're having. So the first one was be curious, and I think we all understand what that means innately. But as a sales individual, how do you be curious without tipping into the point of trying to move that prospect or individual, through that process? How do you keep innate curiosity going?
Well, first, I make sure that I've done my homework prior to, right? So I know who I'm engaging with. I also create an intent. Like I establish what my intent is for the call so that I know at the end, this is really what I want the call to be about. And then I make sure that I list 1 to 3 questions, right? That if I don't get anything else answered, I get those answered because they're going to help me make sure that I meet my intent for the meeting. That being said, being curious is, how I do that is obviously I don't have a lot of questions. I've already done my homework, so I know, and I already know what the intent is. And it's just about asking that second and third and fourth line questions. So that, for example, and I use this all the time, simple little one. We'll do a quick little role play, Michael. And you may think that this is menial because it's so simplistic, but it does share a message, which is this, Michael. If I were to ask you, how are you doing? What would your response be?
I'm doing fine. That's what I'd
Oh,
say.
well, why fine?
Well, it's early in the day. It's only 9. We're on live here. It's 13 minutes in, and just going through the normal Tuesday routine.
And what's a normal Tuesday routine look like? You've already shared the first couple of hours, but what comes after that?
Well, I have a speaking engagement later today, and I'm kind of focused on that. So I'm trying to be present, but also plan for that, and kind of, dialed in on both things. So I'm feeling a little bit extra ready today, maybe a little bit anxious. So just trying to get through that and be the best I can be in those moments.
Well, and look, Michael, the reality is we could have gone a bunch of different ways with that, right? I could have asked you, well, what does good look like? Why are you feeling overly anxious? It depends on whatever the intent is for the call, right?
Right.
But it's, maybe I was going to take you based on my line of questioning, I would have taken you down a path. But today, most times when people ask how you're doing and you were to respond with fine, what do they usually do?
Great. And then they jump into their next
Whatever,
question of what they
right?
wanted to get out of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Being curious just means listening to them, and which is my second listening, right? Actively listening to them and allowing the conversation to flow with the next logical or most natural question that falls after. That's why not having 20 questions is important, because when we have those 20 questions, we're trying to get those 20 questions answered. If we only pick 1 to 3, those are the ones that help us meet our intent. If we just ask our first one and then we start diving in a bit deeper based on the answer they provided, we start getting to really what I call probable root cause, right? Now, that was a simplistic, hi, how are you doing kind of
Right.
conversation, right? But when we're talking about a sales trying to understand what their problem is that we want to solve to, it's really getting to true probable root cause, because in actuality, more times than not, when someone is coming to you because they need to buy something, or you engage with them and they say, yeah, I'm ready, you're usually solving to a systemic problem.
Mm.
And a lot of times they're not even thinking about what the probable cause is. They just know they have a problem and they got to solve it. But when you're curious and you ask those second and third and fourth line questions, you get closer to probable cause. When you can solve to that problem, one, you start to establish a relationship that is a long-term relationship, or at least a longer term than just the sales cycle. Secondly, you're solving to a greater importance, a problem that is of greater importance, and that's where you become sticky. And third is, when you're asking those questions to get to probable root cause, you build this immense credibility with your buyer, because they know you care about them, they know you want to help to solve their problem. And then fourth, they actually uncover themselves. Then you give them these aha moments where they then realize, that is the problem I was trying to solve to, but really this problem, that's the one I need to solve to. And then not only have you built the partnership, you've helped them become a hero in a sense, if you can help
Mm.
them solve that problem.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much there. And I think this idea of asking the second and third and fourth order questions, and you brought up this active listening. We talk about that. I mean, we've talked about active listening since the beginning of probably communication. So much of what you just described is how you approach active listening to understand. Tell us a little bit more about what's going on in your mind as you're having this conversation. How are you balancing listening to those second, third order effects, and also being prepared to ask the next good question, which is what you're really talking about, asking
Yeah.
better questions?
Well, for me, what goes in my mind is I am present and in the moment, and I don't think about that next question, because if I'm already thinking about the next question, I'm not actively listening.
Mm.
And I'm then going through those 20 questions, right? If What I tend to do, and I am a huge note taker, you can do it digitally, you can do it on paper, but I will write notes down so that when, Michael, you've finished whatever that, you've answered that question, there may have been 10 different things. Like when I asked you in the role play that we did, how are you doing? I could have gone with why good, or what does good look like, or why are you feeling anxious? There were a million
Yeah.
different things. And if I'd have written them down, I could have, based on the intent for the meeting, you don't have to have a question as soon as they're done. You can take a second. Hey, Michael, just wait 1 second. I want to finish taking my notes. Okay, looking at my notes. There are a couple of different paths I could go down, but here's what I really want to ask you, right? When you take the time to slow down, it enables you then to speed up to get to exactly what you're trying to accomplish. If you're listening and already thinking of your next question, you've already lost the battle.
Yeah, it's so much of that is very consistent with the methods that you learn in the world of executive coaching, which is this idea of being present in the moment and allowing the coachee to guide the conversation. And your role is to not have all the answers; it's to have the right questions. And I think I love what you just said. I'm not thinking about the next question because I'm being present in the conversation. Just the other day, I got asked to contribute to an article about sales manuals. Why is it important to have a sales manual? And I just sort of laughed and I was like, I'm not going to comment on it. It was a, it was a PR kind of thing or something.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's not the fact that you have one is a problem in some ways because it's not that, again, you shouldn't have a plan and you shouldn't have an approach. But if you have a rigid process and you're just looking to get to the next gate, to your point, people will feel that. The last principle you shared is this idea of being audible ready. That's a unique phrase. Tell us what that means.
Well, first off, I can't take total ownership for that terminology. It is something that I learned back in one of my corporate roles that I had, where I spent a long time there, and they taught us on this concept how to be audible ready. The only way to be audible ready is you have to first listen, right? So you have to engage, and you have to be present in the moment. You have to listen, but it's being able to, when someone provides a response, being able to allow the conversation to naturally flow in the direction that it needs to. And the only way you can be audible ready is if you, one, already do a little bit of research, so you know who you're talking to, right? You know the kind of the you think you know the problems that you're trying to solve, and in this line of questioning, you're asking some of those questions, right? Trying to get to probable root cause. And then you also know what you've prepared, kind of what you sell, right? You have to be on point with your messaging and the value that you provide, who you serve. So you have to be really comfortable in that space. And being audible ready just means that you kind of allow the conversation to flow the way it's naturally going to happen if you're actively listening and if you're being curious. And so that you can shift. So I may have thought, my goal here is to answer all these questions that Michael gave me in prep for today, just as a kind of a guideline, right? Not as a process, but as a guideline, right? And being audible ready means that I don't have to answer any of those questions if we don't get there, right? Being audible ready is, if you ask me a question, I can switch the focus based on what you answer, right? I can either shift my questions, or I can shift and add a different story. I can maybe all of a sudden, like, the way I sell is, I'm not selling a solution, I'm solving a problem. So what I thought may have been, based on what I knew might be a solution, I've realized in my conversation that it's not. And it's maybe guiding them to what I think it might be next, just by asking the questions. Could it be that you need this? Or, I'll give you a good example. There's a prospect that I've been working with, and I really thought he needed a sales and marketing strategy. And my zone of genius is my curiosity, right? And I thought, for some reason, I thought for sure I was going, I had asked that question and I'd gotten a response. Like, it led me to believe he didn't have a sales and marketing strategy. I don't know how I missed it. Like, that is not normal for me. And so I had, at the end, this is what I was going to, this was kind of my idea for a plan. And then when we went back and I asked some questions, I realized, ooh, shoot, that is not at all. Like, somehow I missed this. I'm not going to provide a sales and marketing strategy. So I kind of shifted when I got to the plan part of it. I already knew to take that out based on the questions that I'd asked, and I was able to present a different one. So again, it's just being audible ready means really being able to adapt and to shift based on the way the conversation is flowing, so that it's natural, not awkward. And the only way you can do that is, you got to know what you do, you got to know what they do, you got to listen, and you got to take really good notes, and you've got to be able to be flexible and agile or dynamic.
Yeah, it's so great. I'm gonna draw an analogy here in a second because it really just sort of hit home for me as we were talking. I do want to emphasize a point for people. It comes from the world of coaching. You mentioned taking notes and giving a verbal cue to the individual that you're speaking to that you're taking notes. I think particularly in the world of our digital screen experience today, that's really important, and don't be afraid to signal a pause and let that space be open while you write it down. Your The person you're talking to will be thinking and processing on what they're sharing. It'll feel awkward to you, but not to them. I always talk to people about the importance of a pause. Pauses are incredibly powerful because they give people time to reflect, because the person you're talking to is spending so much time sharing what they're talking about. They're not really listening, right? They're transmitting. right? They're sharing their story. So don't be afraid, for those of you watching, to signal out loud, hey, I'm taking some notes. Can I just have a minute? I want to make sure I get this right. Those kinds of phrases are really powerful for people when you're interacting with them.
Well, and I would also add to that, Michael, it makes them feel like too that they're being heard
Absolutely.
and that you want to remember what they said. So
Right.
it is not just in the silence that it is powerful, that is so powerful, but also the message that you're leaving them with is, I really care about you. Because ultimately, that's really what we as people put buyers aside. We as people want to know that we are being heard and that someone cares. When we
Absolutely.
can implement that, or when we can make others feel that way, even in the buying process, you start to build these amazing relationships. And I don't care what anyone says, selling is about building amazing relationships that is built on trust and credibility.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 1,000%. And, so much of this story is, yeah, I'm a football coach. I played football. A lot of people know that. Everything is a sports analogy for me. But what you're describing is very similar to the world of sports and competition, right? Be prepared. Study, in this case, your opponent, but have a game plan, right? It doesn't mean you list out every play you're going to run in sequence, because you don't know how things are going to unfold. But be prepared. And I tell my athletes, I tell other coaches, right? Success happens at the intersection of preparation and opportunity. And so your part is to prepare, be intentional, right? Have a plan, have a strategy, and then be ready to shift, because the person on the other side of that interaction doesn't know the details of your strategy. They might have a different approach. And this idea of being audible ready, some people might think you were saying, "Oh, be ready to listen." No, you mean audible, like, I'm calling a different play right now.
Exactly. Oh, that's
And
a great analogy. I love
yeah,
it.
and I sit up in the box on game day and we come out and we think they're gonna run defense A and they come out in defense B, and it's like, "All right, well, that ain't going to work. So what are we going to do now, and how are we going to adjust?" And I just think that's a beautiful analogy and way to kind of bring it to life. So we're almost at time, Denise. I want to, you have your bonus question coming up. That's always our fun thing that we do, but I just want to distill it down. Like, what are the three big things you want people to take away from this conversation and the human side of sales?
Three big things in the human side of sales. First off, I would say one, make sure that you are that you really let your buyer know that you care about them. So make it all about them and not at all about you, right? I think when you do that, it will inherently allow you to start asking the question. So one, make it all about them and less about you. Second, don't focus so much on process and focus more on a journey that you both are really
Mm,
navigating together in this process. And I think the third one is you got to solve the probable root cause. When you just stay, when they think that, when your buyers, your prospects think they have a problem to solve, it's definitely a problem, but it's usually not the probable root cause. It's usually the systemic problem. When you can get down to probable root cause, your deal becomes larger, you become stickier, you're building a partnership that's a lasting partnership, and you're solving to the real problem that then clears out all those systemic problems, and you create yourself as a hero, but more importantly, you make your buyer a hero.
yeah. Yeah. I just think it's so great to think about this idea and relate it back to being a human, right? Be connected, be intentional, be present, be curious, find what they need and help them solve it. And again, I'll go back to, I get a lot of people asking me, what problem do you solve? And I'm like, well, it depends. What problem do you have? Right. And really that's there's a lot of mouse traps out there, and people have their proven 6-step, 5-step, 3-step, just follow the process and everything turns out okay. And we just know that humans don't operate that way. Um, before I give you a chance to make an offer to anyone on the call, Denise, we have your bonus question, which I love. And this is really in kind of keeping, I think, a bit with the conversation about influence. So if you could have anyone in the world or at any point follow you on your socials, Instagram, LinkedIn, wherever you are, who would you want to have follow you and why?
Hmm. That's a good question. Because I have some amazing people that follow, but there's a difference between follow and engage. So I would say I would really, there are a couple of good sales evangelists, sales thought leaders that I love, that I engage with, that already we're following one another, but they don't engage with me. One of
Mm.
them, I don't know why, I will say his name, Scott Leese. I love him. And I would love if you ever really engaged with my content. So I would say following is great, but I'd rather have engagement. And engagement, I'd love to have, someone like a Scott Leese engage with my content. I engage with him, he engages with me when I comment, but I haven't never had him engage on my content. Now that would be super cool.
I love it. All right, we're gonna go on a crusade to get Scott to engage. And I love your answer that, following is one thing, but engagement is a whole other. And you opened this call with your strategy to get to the top voice, sort of mountaintop here. And it was all about engagement, right? Purposeful, intentional, thoughtful, curious. I just love that. And I think it
Thank you.
summarizes so perfectly that that's what we are as people. And that's what we want is real connection. Denise, is there anything you'd like to leave folks with as an offer, reach out to
Oh, yes.
connect before we close the call?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, although I've not been as active. I've been going through some, navigating some stuff on my end. So I've not been as active, but I do check LinkedIn. I'm always there sometime during the day. And you will see more content coming out from me. So engage with me there. I will offer to anyone here, and I've got the link. I can put it in the comments below after this. But if you want a kind of a sales check, like a sales pulse check, like, where are you in your strategy? What are some of the things that maybe are challenges that we can help you change, and then what are really that you're doing really well that we can enhance, so that ultimately you can hit your sales goals for this year. We've still got enough time in the year to do that. We've got, what, I think 9 months still left
Yeah.
if you're on a calendar year fiscal. So let me help you by let's doing a kind of a sales pulse check. What can we help adjust so that you can hit your numbers? So I'll put the
Love it.
link below.
Love it. Please reach out to Denise and connect. It's a very generous offer. As you heard in this call, she's the best. And if you want someone to help you with this process, she's the right one to go to. As always, thank you for tuning in. Again, please go to YouTube and subscribe. All the episodes are there. And please hit the newsletter on my profile. We've got great insights coming from this and other conversations. More to come on that. Thanks again for being a part of Top Voice Tuesday, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you, guys.